Well, our last talk today is from Dr. Eeva-Liisa Pelkonen, who is an associate professor at the Yale School of Architecture, where she teaches design history and theory. But her scholarly work deals more specifically with genesis and meaning of form in various geographic and historical contexts. This is the part which is always a bit depressing for people introducing others. She has a long list of publications that make me feel somewhat lazy. The first one is Achtung Architecture, Image and Phantasm in Contemporary Austrian Architecture from 1996. Alvar Aalto, Architecture, Modernity and Geopolitics from 2009. Kevin Roach, Architecture and as an Environment from 2011. And a co-editor with Donald Albrecht of Eero Saarinen, Shaping the Future from 2006. And her most recent book, Exhibit A, Exhibitions That Transformed Architecture, was only published in June of this year by Pfeiffer. So, with that impressive list, let's welcome Eeva-Liisa Pelkonen, who's going to talk about the recurrence of certain traditional forms.
Yeah,
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for sticking around, and I have to say it's a little bit frightening to be the last. I've been rewriting my talk throughout, but I hope this is helpful in terms of kind of setting a certain kind of conceptual and historiographical premise how this issue of modern architecture's relationship to past has been conceptualized and theorized. But I want to start with the T.S. Eliot's well-known 1919 essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which exposed the key paradox facing the modern artist. In order to create something new, one had to engage the past. According to him, instead of, quote, blind or timid adherence to previous successes, unquote, writers should engage the work of bygone writers on an equal plane. His poem Wasteland set an example. In it, Shakespeare is treated as a fellow traveler in the land of modernity, as relevant and modern as any contemporaneous writer. This required, according to Eliot, that the writer possesses what he calls historical sense, which involves not only, quote, perception of pastiness of the past, but of its presence, unquote. The following paragraph, rich of temporal indicators, elaborates what he meant by this notion. The historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless and of the temporal together, is what makes the writer traditional, and it is at the same time what makes a writer accurately conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. So in other words, the notion of historical sense and being traditional could be pinned down to a single instance where, quote, past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. So my paper discusses how several preeminent architectural historians defined this relationship between modern architecture along the same lines. That is, how could modern architecture retain aspects of the past without compromising its forward thrust? I will highlight the complicated and somewhat axonomeric temporal concepts and complicated historiographical models of their text. And I want to note from get-go that the term modern architecture entails in this text a rather broad spectrum of works, and so does the term modern, as they struggled to come to terms with the complex temporalities that the concept entailed. I want to start with the book on the left by called American Spirit in Architecture by a Columbia University-based architect turned architectural historian Talbot Faulkner Hamlin, who echoed Eliot by proposing that the first generation of modern American architects were able to engage the past and still create something new. The chapter, The New American Gothic, helps decipher what this meant in practice. What was new was a shift from a faithful copying of the past styles, read formally more abstract emulation of historical styles. Bernard Grosvenor Goodhue's University Chapel for Chicago, University of Chicago, with its soaring verticality, is cited as a prime example. Hamlin describes the building as follows: great piles of masonry, touches of sculpture, all in the least stylistic manner, add to rather than detract from the Gothic feeling of rich tracery. It is Gothic, obviously, but a Gothic which is purely modern, purely American, looking forward into the future. Unquote. Eliel Saarinen's second prize-winning entry to the Chicago Tribune competition from 1922 exemplified a move to even further away from standard historicist mode of design. He writes about the project as follows, quote, it abandons the historical precedent of the winning Howell's Hood design. Its detail is purely modern, non-stylistic. Its emphasis on vertical lines is daringly bold, and its silhouette of setbacks and breaks interesting, powerful, and well-proportioned. So the project is the one in the middle. Hamlin continues to exclaim that, quote, simple, straightforward honesty is all too rare, unquote, and proposes that increased formal emphasis would deliver a more immediate impression in the mind of the onlooker. What made these new Gothic buildings both new and modern was the ability to transcend a retrograde adherence to historical precedent and invest the most dominant formal characteristic of Gothic architecture, namely its verticality, which delivered an intense and immediate experience legible to all. The chapter called The Future of American Architecture, in the chapter of The Future of American Architecture, Hamlin concludes his thesis. Forms which men have loved through the centuries will not pass away the threat of a theory, nor will reverence for them prevent the creation of new forms. The question that will be asked of the details of a building in the future are not, is it correct, is it old, is it new, but rather, is it natural, inevitable result of its place, its function, its material, and above all, is it beautiful? Does it speak deeply to the emotions of all great art must? So this Hamlin's, in this romantic credo, Hamlin tends towards the idea that architecture is tending towards timelessness and universal values, which are present in pure form and accessible through feeling rather than reason. This idea that idea of timeless form as a means to grapple with change haunts Fiske Kimball's short 1980 book American Architecture as well. The architect writes, after exclaiming that artistic creation is a never-ending stream and that, quote, art must change to live, he exclaims in a very cryptic manner that among the American architects are more than one who give promise of living on, not merely as the founders of great schools of the past, but as masters who can speak out of the past in the eternal language of form, unquote. So this idea that masters speak out of the past with an eternal language of form reminds us of Eliot's belief that all great works of art don't only reside in the past, but have an ability to be relevant through time. And of course, this sentence entails a seeming paradox. The only response to change was to step out of time and embrace timeliness, Kimball reasoned. And like Hamlin, he locates the birth of modern architecture around 1890, when architects like McKimney and White went beyond the revivalist imitation with buildings that, quote, reaffirmed the supremacy of form, unquote. He too believed that transcending historicist imitation requires replacing knowledge with feeling. Louis Sullivan serves as an epitome of this trend. He writes, quote, the artist has felt, not calculated. The building is vitally unified in a form and deeply felt by its creator. So next, I want to talk about this book by a very, maybe a better known historian, Henry Russell Hitchcock, his 1929 book, Modern Architecture, Romanticism and Reintegration, which was the first survey of European international style modern architecture written by an American scholar. The book continues to argue that modern architecture stems from what came before. And without naming Walter Gropius's and his 1925 book, Internationale Architektur, the book serves as a foil, as Hitchcock justifies the need to take a longer historical perspective in the introduction as follows. So he writes, the literature of the architecture of the present seem disproportionately profuse beside that of the architecture of the past. Thus the illusion is reinforced that the present is a period distinct from or opposed to the past. Historical criticism should, however, be able to show that as regards architecture, the present is the last realized point in the dialectic of history, and that even the most advanced contemporary firms constitute no rootless phenomenon, but the last phase in the long line of development. Hitchcock continues to observe that the modern movement was born out of two conflicting temporal trajectories, quote, leaning forward on one hand, and, quote, a sentimental desire to recall one or several styles of the far past, and by an inertia which has caused a considerable retention of the features of style of the near past, unquote. So the book Hitchcock uses the oxymoronic term new tradition, how can a tradition be new, to refer to the moment in the late 19th century architecture which collapsed past and future to produce something new and contemporary. The group of new traditionalist architects included American architects such as H.H. Richardson and Louis Sullivan, as well as their European counterparts such as Dutch Henrik Petrus Berlage, Viennese Otto Wagner, Swede Ragnar Östberg, and Finn Eliasaren, who at this point had already established a successful career in America. With a language rich with temporal markers, he celebrates their ability to combine, quote, innovation and, quote, experimentation with an ability to recall, retention, and emulation and copying of past elements, as he points out, quote, the general interest in the architecture of the past among them. And Hitchcock emphasized this increased, like his kind of predecessors, Hamlin and Fiske Kimball, Hitchcock too emphasizes the increased stylization and, quote, reduction of historical styles, which also allowed these figures to blend their borrowings so subtly that the public was persuaded there was no reminiscence of the past at all in their work. This is just one of the pairing that he shows of Östberg, Stockholm City Hall and the Zone Museum, suggesting how this kind of stylistic reduction happens. So in the final part of modern architecture, it's devoted to what he calls equally oxymorically the new pioneers, which suggests that they were not the first pioneers. These new ones included Le Corbusier and Oud, who had by that time helped indeed to pioneer the formal language of what Gropius had labeled international architecture, that is architecture known for white flat roof buildings devoid of ornamentation. Again, the following passage captures that Hitchcock was at that time fully aware of the challenge faced by all historians, namely how to write history, and let alone define a new style, considering that time never comes to a standstill. He writes towards the end of the book, how long the period of development will last, no longer new, will reach its climax, how long before it will be in its turn superseded. It is absurd to attempt to say. The tempo of the future escapes us more than anything else about it. The general impression of the crescendo is surely illusory, and due to the fact that the very minor events of the present appear to be set pace equivalent to that of the major events of the past. So in light of the exhibition of the perhaps more famous book, International Style, and the parallel exhibition, Modern Architecture International Exhibition, that Hitchcock co-wrote and co-curated with Philip Johnson, it is worth noting, and it's interesting, that this previous book is structured around these sort of transitory moments rather than stylistic periods at their full bloom. The appendix in this book is particularly interesting, noting that the two styles which feature prominently in the modernist imagination, the Gothic and the Baroque, had both resulted in kind of formal misprecision of past styles. So it's interesting them not as because they are this sort of height of stylistic formation, but because they are kind of transitory in a sense. So Hitchcock observes, for example, how the late Gothic builders, quote, replaced themes of design which required the memory of the past for their appreciation, with themes that expressed more accurately the actual structure. And he then, maybe perhaps more interestingly, says that Baroque architects, quote, used elements it had received from the immediate past for ends quite unconnected with their original structural meaning. So the way the Baroque was even more kind of fluid in terms how it was able to recall or emulate the past. So he actually then calls that the Baroque is important because it's the, quote, last wholly integrated style phase of the modern period, not because of its newness, but rather for its ability to balance the quote, sentimental reminiscence and intellectual experiment in the manner that translated into a kind of fluid transhistorical formal play. So that's kind of, now I'm kind of shifting to finally to this idea of the Baroque Eons that appear in my title, where the kind of Gothic loses prominence as the historical reference point, and Baroque Eons, emerge as this sort of reference point for this sort of more fluid idea of what modern architecture and more to be modern means. So this is the cover of Sigrid Gideon's magnus opus, Space, Time and Architecture, The Growth of a New Tradition, that makes kind of basically the same argument and borrows, I believe, the argument from Hitchcock that he writes, quote, the historian nowadays seems more concerned with the links between the periods, the lines of force that persist and develop through several periods, than with those especially aspects which separate each period from each other. So again, we are not looking at style in full bloom, but this sort of transitional moments and continuities between through time. His contribution to this conversation regarding modern architecture's relationship to past was to consider modern architecture as a part of a larger continuum, not only what went before, but what comes after. It was just a kind of a sliver of time. He writes beautifully, quote, present-day happenings are simply the most conspicuous section of a continuum. And continues to define the way past and present merge in in modern architecture as follows. Quote, they are like the small series of wavelengths between ultraviolet and infrared, which translate themselves into colors visible to the human eye. And he borrows already in the title Hitchcock's term, the new tradition, and added to that two interesting new concepts, namely the idea of the constituent fact and latency. The former suggests that architecture was in an internally driven morphology that allowed Gideon to draw these sort of transhistorical analogues across time and space between periods. The idea of constituent fact suggests that certain formal tropes and motifs reappear even after being dormant at intermittent points throughout history. The notion of latency, of course, suggests that he had read Sigmund Freud, the idea of Latenzeit, which the pioneering psychoanalysts used to refer to kind of unconscious, repressed drives, which again somewhat uncontrollably resurface in human behavior. So that's important when we talk about recalling past. It's kind of something that happens somewhat out of control of the author, the architect itself. So this is where the curvilinear form and of the Baroque gains prominence. It plays a significant role in Gideon's book in general, and it is one of these sort of exemplary constituent facts in the history of architecture. So he traces the moment, the motive to the Baroque era, more specifically to Borromini, and sees how it travels through time, changing its structural, functional meaning, traveling to new locations. And here he writes about the Baroque as a kind of almost like a virulent style that, again, is able to migrate almost like an agent with the agency of its own. said Baroque manifests itself as a new power to mold space and to produce astonishing and unified whole from most various parts. And the way he talks about Baroque suggests that he didn't really consider it as a historical style at all, rather than a kind of state of mind, which even when repressed would kind of percolate to the surface. And here it's hard not to be reminded of the date of the book. Gideon wrote this book in the late 30s while actually teaching at Harvard. The book was published during the Second World War, so this idea of something being repressed, waiting to percolate to the surface, gained a kind of a very potent geopolitical meaning. Of course, it's also a moment that modern architecture had come under attack. So there's a sense of that it was something latent, even at this time. It is also likely that, I mean, Gideon was not alone who was celebrating Baroque in those terms. He might have well read a book by a famous Catalan philosopher, Eugenio Dors, a book called Lo Barroco. I love this term, Lo Barroco, that was published in 1930 and in French in 1935. It's a very famous kind of public intellectual. And he too, Dors too, treats Baroque more than as an attitude rather than as a style. If Gideon indeed read Dors, he would have been drawn to the idea of this sort of idea of this sort of infinite folding of different temporalities and geographies into a kind of universal and transhistorical Baroque sense of time, place and time. This is what Dors was talking about, that Baroque it's a kind of a mentality that also transcends, enables people to transcend place and time. So there's a kind of a universal humanist mode also, which is very important with Baroque. If Gothic still kind of implied the kind of Protestant, ethos, Baroque was this sort of more virulent universalist mode of or mentality. And it is interesting also what Dors introduces in actually a name of a chapter in the book is called the Eon. This idea that we are not only operating in kind of historical period of known time, but that there's this sort of completely other type of temporal dimension that also treats history more as a kind of a continuous process and transformation. I mean, Riegel comes to mind in a mutation. It's interested in transformation, process, mutation, rather than this sort of compartmentalized idea of historical time or clock time or even linear time. It is actually in this chapter that also Dors uses the word constant. So it's very likely that Gideon got this word from that indeed in history there are these sort of constant which represent a certain stability in this sort of eternal change. And it is also interesting that Gideon probably also relating to Dors includes that this curvilinear form also recalls, it doesn't begin with Baroque, but the form itself recalls kind of earlier primitive forms, folkish forms, and that even the Baroque is not a beginning or a style, but just a little brief moment in this eon of time. It's really a beautiful read. It is in my final point. Actually, it's interesting. Gideon's book was, of course, came in multiple editions. Was first published in 1941, and then again 1942, 1954, 1960. I mean, basically every 5 years. So it's kind of interesting what it means for a historian also to be writing the same book many times. So you can imagine that these sort of constituent facts. So here he in the second edition he lands on the Finnish Alvar Aalto, and he writes to Aalto that I finally kind of, you make me sense of my whole thesis, that this is the Baroque coming to the surface after the war, after the kind of being repressed, that after the war 49 this is resurfacing. And again you see the kind of thesis what already Hitchcock makes about the Baroque, that Baroque form is somehow looser, that it allows it to migrate to different contents, the different materials, different functions, that it has this sort of lucidity that let's say the Gothic or the classical would not have. You can see it actually in the plan of the Finnish pavilion in New York, in the vases, I mean the buildings, there are many more in full-scale buildings. And then of course this sort of idea that it can also gain a multitude of meanings along the way, that it somehow kind of freely attaches to meanings. He makes this sort of geographic argument that somehow it relates also to the Finnish landscape. So in conclusion, I would want to just point out that Gideon's contribution to this idea of how modern architecture recalls the past or emulates the past. We noted already that in the first phase, it was kind of moving beyond historicism, that we are no longer copying precedent, that we are taking something else, something more freely, maybe in that kind of new Gothic phase. But I think the Gideon phase, the Baroque phase, is interesting because it complicates this equation by introducing kind of two variables, kind of moving variables into the equation. First of all, both the architect and historian are kind of moving in time. They are historical subjects. The historian is no longer outside history, but in history, observing. He always writes that historian writes contemporary history, that you are in the history, you are not outside it when you are writing it. And then the second, this celebration of the Baroque, which assumes that neither forms are kind of stuck in the past, and the meaning that they gained in the past, but they too are these sort of moving targets that they move through history, gaining new meanings. They migrate through space and time and gain new meanings along the way. So I guess in summary, acknowledging that the world is changing all the time. Thank you.